and welcome to episode 6 of Mind Matters Magazine's Expert Talk series, Mind the Brain. I sat with Dr. Sarah Mckay, who is a neuroscientist who specializes in translating science into simple, actionable strategies for health and well-being. Dr. Mckay is the director of the Neuroscience Academy, which offers online learning and in-person training focused on the practical application of neuroscience, positive psychology, and mind-body medicine. Dr. Mckay is also an Oxford University-educated neuroscientist, educator, presenter, media commentator, as I said, director of the Neuroscience Academy, and the author of 2 books, one called The Women's Brain Book, which talks about the neuroscience of health, hormones, and happiness, and the second is called Demystifying the Female Brain. Dr. Mckay writes for numerous publications and has been published extensively for professional audiences. She's been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, Australian Women's Health, Daily Life, Sydney Morning Herald, and Body and Soul, and has been heard and seen on Australia's SBS Insight, ABC Radio National, Balanced by Deborah Hutton, and The Exchange TV, and many more. We've been honored to have her as our guest speaker today, and without further ado, let's move on to the video. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of Mind Matters Magazine's Expert Talk series, Mind the Brain. I'm seated here today with Dr. Sarah Mckay. Dr. Mckay, it's an honor having you here today as our guest. Dr. Mckay, you are an incredible neuroscientist and you've done a lot of research in the neuroscience field and you have a lot of achievements under your belt. So one of your achievements that I've been very keen on understanding is that of the Neuroscience Academy. So could you just tell us what was your inspiration behind starting the Neuroscience Academy?
Oh, thank you very much. Well, the Neuroscience Academy I set up as an online program to teach people about neuroscience, and essentially it's for people who are probably a bit older than you and perhaps a lot of your audience, people who are already working in professional work. So I have a lot of people who are psychologists, perhaps doctors, therapists, a lot of teachers who come through who may have been working in their professions for a number of years and they've become more and more interested in neuroscience. And a lot of the time they didn't get to study neuroscience at university, learn about it at school. Perhaps it didn't exist as a discipline back when they were training, or perhaps it was just never their focus. And they've become more and more and more interested in how can an understanding of the brain help us then understand why we think and feel and do what we do. And so I wanted to put together an online program so I could reach a whole global audience, an education program in neuroscience that would help all of these professionals have access to the science education that they may never have had.
And I think that's really great, especially because I see while I'm getting into neuroscience right now and I'm planning on majoring in it, I see my mom's also developed an interest in neuroscience alongside me.
Yeah.
Me along the process as well. So I think it's really great that you have something like that.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know how old most of your audience is. I'm 45 now. When I went in my first year of university, so that was 1993, that was when in New Zealand the first sort of neuroscience degree was created in a university in New Zealand that pulled together all these neuroscience from psychology and physiology and pharmacology and psychology and kind of pulled it all together into this one degree discipline. So if you were at university or, in education in the 70s or 80s or even the early 90s, you wouldn't have had access to any of that because it was just so new. And I think really it's only been in about the last 10 years that a lot of the findings from the lab we've been able to kind of take out and make relevant and usable to people's lives. So I think there's this amazing focus for people your age in STEM education, but I kind of think I also want to educate a lot of the people who are still sometimes the people who are in power and making the decisions that affect everyone. I want them to be educated too, and not, education isn't just for young people, it's for all ages.
And you touched upon something right now, actually, about how neuroscience is very new, right? In a sense, it's new, and there are a lot of misconceptions that come because neuroscience as a field is very new. Are there any misconceptions that you've heard of that you think are outrageous?
Oh my goodness, there's quite a lot. I suppose if I think about the ones that I get asked about the most, one that I get asked about a lot is, do we only use 10% of our brain? And I don't think that's a misconception. I just think that that's kind of the wrong way of thinking about how the brain does what the brain does, and perhaps harks back to the time when we used to ask questions about where in the brain does this particular function happen, where in the brain do we see, where in the brain do we feel, and now we ask a different question. We ask, how does the brain create the sensation of sight, or how does the brain create an emotion that we feel, and what's our conscious experience of that? And when we start asking the questions in a different way, we stop asking questions that are almost in a way meaningless. So if we say we only use 10% of our brain, well, that means we don't understand that there are parts of our brain that are very busy all the time regulating heart rate and regulating breathing and regulating our hormones and making sure that our muscles in our core are holding us upright. We've got parts of our brain which are perhaps controlling body movement as we're walking along the street, but we're not consciously thinking about that. So perhaps the question is how much of our brain is involved with what we consciously are aware of, or how much of our brain is involved in what we're paying attention to versus how much of our brain is processing below our consciousness. So I think, sometimes there's questions that I would like, maybe they're not myth busting, it's just we're asking them based on old knowledge. The other question that I get asked all the time, because I've written a book about women's brain health, is, are women's brains and men's brains completely different? And that's also kind of not the right question to ask, because if we were to open up the skull and pull a brain out of a man or a woman and put it on a bench, we wouldn't be able to tell if it was a male or a female brain. It's not like pink or blue. It's not pink for girls' brains and blue for boys' brains. By and large, they're quite similar in structure, and by and large, most of the functions, most of the behaviours and ways of thinking and feeling are pretty similar. Occasionally there's little differences, and if we kind of burrow all the way down inside the brain, we get to a region of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is involved with a lot of hormone regulation and integrates kind of our body and our brain and regulates a lot of basic body functions. So in women's brains, there's a region in the hypothalamus that controls ovulation. Obviously, a man's brain does not have a region that controls ovulation, so there's a big difference there. But then people might say, oh, well, why are women so much more emotional than men? Is that because of their brains? And there's no emotion centre in the brain that's bigger or smaller in women than men. Often that's just a reflection of a gender stereotype that we may have that's got nothing to do with neuroscience.
And that's actually a really interesting topic as well. So I have a podcast that I do with a few friends where we talk about neuroscience myths. That was the last episode. And we spoke about this very same concept, how people tend to think that women are more emotional than men. And there was a study that was done where the researchers found that the amygdala for men are actually slightly larger than women's. And amygdala is considered to be the emotion center, right, of the brain. So that was very interesting. But then we came to this conclusion that it could actually be, just as you said, gender stereotyping, which is implicitly there in science. So have you ever experienced something like that? And how have you overcome gender stereotyping in the workplace, per se?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, actually, because I grew up in New Zealand. And when I was growing up, we had a couple of female prime ministers, even when I was in primary school and high school. And we've got a very good female prime minister right now in New Zealand. I had a really open mum who talked about everything, and I went to a girls' school, and it was very empowering. And I honestly grew up as a kid. I grew up in the 80s and 90s in New Zealand and never thought about, oh, I'm a girl, I can do this or I can't do that. It just never entered my mind. And I think part of that was growing up where I did. And then when I went off to university, I never thought, should I study science or not? I just really loved it, and so that was what I did. It was very interesting. Then when I went off to Oxford, there was 5 people who got my scholarship, 5 people who got a master's and PhD scholarship to study neuroscience in my year. There was 5 of us, 3 were girls and 2 guys. So in the neurosciences, at least, and it's different for different scientific disciplines, the neuroscience has always had quite a lot of gender balance. There's probably similar numbers of males and females studying and going through. In psychology, there's a lot more women than men, but if you get to what we might call the harder sciences like physics, there's often in maths there's more men than women, but that kind of changes over time as well. I remember I was at university 20 years ago, not now, but certainly because of the discipline I was in, I never personally felt in any way that I was experiencing any kind of stereotyping or anything like that. And it's really, I suppose, only been in about the last 5 or so years with the next kind of wave of feminism, which has kind of emerged, that I've even really reflected on any of my life experiences in that way. And I think that was one of the triggers for writing my book about women's brain health was, I've been doing neuroscience for 25 years and I've had a female body and brain my whole life, but I hadn't gone down that pathway of neuroscience. I think I've been pretty fortunate. I've had a lot of doors open up to me. I'm really lucky with how I was brought up. And I can be quite scary. So maybe, I personally haven't faced too many obstacles in my life and in my career. But I think neuroscience is a pretty balanced subject. That's not to say if you were to go into a university and look at who are the professors, a lot of the time there'll be more men than women. But I think that's kind of it doesn't matter whether you're in economics, whether you're in, medicine, whether you're in science, men do kind of tend to increase in number once you get further and further through, and there's lots and lots of reasons for that. But so far, I've done okay. That's not to say other women haven't had very different experiences from me. I think I've just been really fortunate to have a lot of doors open. Yeah, and I've been determined to walk through them when they open as well. And I've gone knocking on doors and looking around everywhere, jumping through windows and everything.
That's great to hear, and I'm sure that's empowering for us feminists listening as well.
I hope so.
I have an interesting and kind of personal question now. What got you interested in neuroscience? Like, everyone has an interesting backstory, so I'm sure you're really interesting.
So I was always loved school and was a reader. Read every single book that you could, got my hands on. So I loved science and I loved chemistry and biology and all of those subjects. And I went off to my first year of university and I was doing psychology in my first year of university, in chemistry and biology and all of the sciences. And I was in psychology, and they we had a section on kind of the biology of psychology. So it was the very first time I'd ever learned about what a neuron is and a synapse. And I was just like, oh my God, this is the coolest thing ever. And then that lecturer recommended that we read a book. And I have the book right next to me, this book here. I don't know whether you've come across this book. It's called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks is really kind of inspired generations of people to study neuroscience. And if you've read the book, you'll know why the book was so awesome. If you haven't read the book, Oliver Sacks is a neurologist. He passed away a few years ago now. And he wrote these amazing case studies. He's such an amazing writer about all of the really strange things that can go wrong with people's thinking and feeling and behaving when things go wrong with their brains. And I was just utterly captivated by that book. And then I was just talking about it to people, and then someone mentioned to me, hey, did you know that, so I was at that time, I was at Canterbury University, this is 1993, I was at Canterbury University in Christchurch in New Zealand, and someone said, hey, did you know at Otago University, which is in Dunedin, about 4 hours south, they said, oh, there's this brand new degree discipline of neuroscience. And I went, oh, and so I changed universities and went there. So it was really like love at first sight. And I have not deviated from that path since, because you would know, like, there's so much, it's such a broad, deep, rich subject. There's so many different things that you can understand, from genes to brains to behaviour to society. Like, you're never going to run out of things to think about and be curious about. I just utterly love it. More and more, I think I love it more now than I used to.
I agree completely with you, and I feel like neuroscience has something for everyone. There's a little bit of physics, there's a little bit of chemistry, there's biology, there's everything for everyone.
Yeah. Psychology, sociology, yeah, that's so true. And it's funny because there is like chemistry and maths and physics for the people who are really into that kind of, so you can like get into computational neurobiology, or you can get into molecular neuroscience, or you can get into systems neuroscience or psychology, or you can even look at aging or child development or the teenage brain. There's just so many fascinating paths to go down. So why would you do anything else?
Exactly. And the book that you just held up, so it's the character has prosopagnosia, right? And that's why they can't recognize they can't recognize their wife. They have prosopagnosia.
Yeah, so he gets confused. He sometimes thinks that one object is another object. Like he's walking along the road and he sees like a post on the side of the road and he thinks it's a person and he starts talking to it. And in this instance, he thinks his wife is his hat and he goes to kind of put her on his head. So that's why it's called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. So it's quite an unusual title. But when you read the book, then you go, now I get it. And you learn so much about the basics of brain biology and this amazingly beautifully told stories. They're quite sad stories as well along the way. And I think that's the thing, we can focus so much on what's interesting about the brain and how it works and understand why we are the way we are. But there's such a huge global burden of disease that is brain-based, from mental health problems to addiction to diseases of aging like Alzheimer's. So there's spinal cord injury, brain injury. There's a whole lot of disease burden in the world that neuroscience can help to answer.
And especially now, so I've read a couple of papers that are talking about how COVID-19 can cause encephalitis. And I thought that's really interesting. A lot of people have misconceptions on COVID-19. We think that it's just a respiratory issue, but I mean, it has huge neurological implications. And kind of on that note, are there any neurological disorders or diseases that you think are really interesting and we should do more research into?
Oh, gosh. Well, I worked in my first postdoc. So after my PhD, I went and did postdoc research. I moved here to Sydney and I worked in spinal cord injury. And I do think spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury are really incredibly sad. And I think under-recognised in how we just kind of think about, someone can't walk. But there's a whole host of really interesting outcomes to one's whole health, their mental health, and lots of different aspects of their body that come about by the fact that the brain can't communicate with the body through the spinal cord. So I think it's a really interesting disease. And certainly if you look at the economic impact of someone who's suffered that type of injury, it's absolutely enormous. And brain injury is kind of similar. There's no easy fix. The central nervous system can't regenerate and repair its own neurons. It tries to, but the environment in which it's in won't kind of let it. So I think that's one really, really interesting area of research that I've always my heart has always it's got a little place in my heart. And I think perhaps more generally and relevant to this year, although there's a lot of people with an interest in this space, there's not so many people interested in spinal injury, but I'm really interested in anxiety and worrying. This year, everyone's like, the entire world, you're in India, I'm in Sydney, I was just talking to someone in Dublin. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, this year has completely just blindsided us all. And so much of that is around uncertainty and the unknown and loss of control, and everyone's anxiety levels have gone up and up and up in response to the stress because of the situation that the entire world's in. And so I'm really interested in the brain biology and the neurobiology of stress responses, kind of unregulated fear, anxiety, and how all of that kind of plays in. Because for a lot of us, we're actually not being, attacked by some kind of wild animal. We're just all kind of sitting on our sofas at home, not really going anywhere and getting more and more stressed and worried. And it's having physical effects on us. And we all should be staying at home and staying safe and not spreading the virus. But for me, I'm really interested in that space as well. There's a lot of people working in that space. If I was going to put my money somewhere, I'd put it in spinal cord injury.
I agree with you to that extent as well. And I have another kind of twisted question maybe, but how have you seen the course of neuroscience change in the years that you've been doing it? And how do you foresee it to go in the future? Like, what do you see and what have you seen?
It's so big. It's hard to look, you know, I kind of, if I look back and look at it as a whole, what I see is that we're starting to find out more that we can use and we can apply. So we understand more about diseases, that we can, you know, more about Alzheimer's and what's going on, how can we prevent that. We understand, you know, what's going on in spinal cord injury and what can we kind of do to help. We can't necessarily prevent it, what can we do to help that. So we're starting to get closer from the, you know, the bench to the bedside, and also in things like, you know, understanding stress responses, perhaps understanding light dark, circadian rhythms. There's a whole lot of things where we used to understand just the real reductionist basic biology, and now we're starting to see, well, how does that actually impact how I live? I suppose a lot of the kind of changes that I've seen, if I look back from when I was an undergraduate until now, would really kind of be all around the kind of the genetic revolution. I remember when the human genome was first sequenced, back at the kind of the turn of the century, and so how that's influenced how research is done is extraordinary compared to where we were back in the early 90s when that kind of technology wasn't available. So I have no idea where it's going to go. It's because you kind of don't know what you don't know. I don't know what technologies are kind of going to emerge. I think it's going to get more complicated, because we're only going to find out more and more detail. So we're going to need all the people that are working on all of that detail to keep doing what they're doing. But I think we also need people who can kind of pull back and see the big picture and kind of think, well, how can we use this? How is this relevant? What can we do with this? And I mean, I suppose we're seeing this year science play out kind of in like live stream science in terms of COVID-19, because we went from January when no one had ever heard from it until now when so many people understand a bit more about virology and how vaccines can be developed and how clinical trials work and how we didn't understand about this virus, and we've kind of seen how scientists have learned and how health measures and public health kind of recommendations have come and gone based on the science kind of building. So I think it's really cool to like look at the progression of science through this year as an example of how things change as we gain more and more information. I think it's also a really important lesson for the science doubters out there who like, oh, science, the facts change, that means we were told a lie. That's not how science works, it's this process. So I think one thing that used to frustrate me a little bit about academia, which I think this year has shown is possible, is how slow it moved and sometimes how slowly research went. Whereas this year we've seen how rapid it can be when we absolutely have to put our focus on something. So that's, you know, more of a reflection on science, I think, or medical biology than just neuroscience.
Yeah, and actually it makes sense. Neuroscience is a very broad field, so
yeah,
it's hard to pinpoint how it has changed, but I completely agree with what you're saying. And kind of as a concluding thought, you have done so much research as well, and I aspire to be a neuroscience researcher, and I know there are many others who aspire to be researchers as well. So do you have any tips for us?
I think one mistake I made early on in my career was not really, and this sounds so cheesy, but it's so true, was not really following my heart and choosing my PhD topic I enjoyed, but my heart didn't lie in it. Now it is proving more useful because I was really kind of looking at nature, nurture, and neuroplasticity, but back then we didn't even use the word neuroplasticity. So I shied away in my choice of research lab because I kind of was doing what I thought I should do rather than what I really was deeply interested in. And I was really interested in, as I said, the sort of the injury side, the spinal cord injury side of things. And there were various reasons why I just didn't feel like I had the confidence to follow the research path that I wanted. I also think in terms of your research career, you know, you've got to work on, you know, something that your heart and soul is into. But I also do think it is really useful to choose a really, really good research lab that is going to support you as a PhD student. And don't always just go for like the big kind of shiny famous person name, because that doesn't always necessarily work out. the best thing that you can do before you make any decisions about which group to go into is go and talk to the people who are already in there and ask if you can have a chat. Try and find out as much about the working environment as you can, because you could be spending 3, 4, or 5 times of your full-time life embedded within that space. And you know, you've got the love of the subject that you're working on and the problem that you're trying to solve, but you better make sure, it's so important, that it's a really supportive environment and that they've got a good kind of plan of how they're going to get you through that especially that PhD process. Because I think you know, sometimes you follow your heart, but you've also got to make a really sensible, wise decision as well. So don't be kind of blinded by, you know, the shiny objects. Make really well-informed, careful decisions along that way too. I think I always remember once upon a time I was in Edinburgh in Scotland, and there was a PhD position offered in a lab of a very, very famous neuroscientist, and I was quite starstruck, and I went to the lab and met this person and was kind of interested in the subject, but was so starstruck I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be amazing. And then was walking out along the road, and one of his PhD students came running up the road after me. I was like, stop, I have to talk to you, it was my turn. And he said, and they all had turns each day to talk to people who came to visit the lab about, don't come and work for this person, because don't be starstruck, because this is the most horrible place to work, and we're all kind of trapped. I mean, this is a long time ago now. This is like 1998 or 99 or something. But it really taught me a really important lesson about making an informed decision about who you're going to be going and spending the next 3 or 4 or 5 years with as well. So after that point, then I always went and talked to all the people in the lab. As I said, I loved my PhD. Maybe my heart wasn't necessarily totally in the subject, but I did spend lots of time having coffee with all the different people, and they really assured me that I would have a good experience. I did have a good experience, but it wasn't until my postdoc, when I've completely followed down the path that I was passionate in, that I kind of really felt like I'd found my niche. So that would be my advice.
I think that is great advice. I know.
And you're doing what you're doing now is like picking people's brains, like just talking to as many people as you can. And like back when I was choosing my PhD, there was the internet barely, honestly, the internet barely existed. You could email people, but you couldn't find out much information about anyone. You know, you couldn't go to a research lab and find who the research the PhD students were and find out their email and email them. And you couldn't do stuff. This was the olden days. So you've got all these resources now where you can like pull this information in before you make a decision. I was kind of flying blind.
And yeah, I think reaching out also is very important. Like I sent you an email and you were kind enough to respond back, and now we have this episode.
I mean, it was so, as I say, it was the most beautifully written email. I couldn't say no, and I love what you guys are doing. So it's, you know.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you for joining us today. It was an incredible session, and yeah, I'll have all your links in the description box for our viewers to see and check out your website and check out more about you. So thank you again.
Well, thank you so much, and good luck with everything you're doing. And I am absolutely certain you'll have as a glorious and interesting career as I've had. It'd be hard not to if you choose neuroscience. So
thank you.
You've made a good call.